Hello history friends! It's the Elk Valley Pride Festival here in Fernie this week, and in honor of that august occasion, I intended to bring you an uplifting, inspirational video about LGBTQ+ history, the history of tolerance and inclusion in Canadian society. And so, I did some research. So then I thought, if we couldn't do something uplifting, at the very least, we could do something really, really old. The first documented trial of a gay European man in Canada. The drummer of Ville-Marie. Who was he? What happened to him? And why are people such a bunch of jerks? Warning! As you have probably gathered, the following video is going to include mentions of violence, injustice, wigs, and the fact that sometimes humans have sex with other humans. If you are a person or the parent or guardian of a person who is better off not encountering these facts today, then I suggest you shut her down now. Like a lot of marginalized groups, ordinary queer people are a pain to research because most of the important people who wrote things down were either wildly misrepresenting them or actively pretending that they didn't exist for the sake of the children. When they do show up in official records, it's usually because they are being persecuted, arrested, imprisoned, or executed. This is also generally true for people who are poor, and our protagonist was both. So, the following is going to be served with a heaping helping of guesswork. Our story takes us all the way back to 1642, also known as Musketeer times, and a brushy little island in the middle of the St. Lawrence called Île de Montréal. In May of 1642, a group of approximately 50 people, led by a fervently religious former soldier named Paul de Chaumeday and an also fervently religious nurse named Jeanne Mance, established a settlement on the Île de Montréal at the confluence of the St. Lawrence and Ottawa rivers. They called their little hamlet Ville-Marie, after the Virgin Mary. Unlike a lot of the early Canadian settlements, which were mostly focused on trading furs and timber and making loads of money for the French crown, Ville-Marie was intended as a missionary settlement, a model Catholic community in the middle of the wilderness. It was funded not by the king, but by a group of well-meaning Catholic zealots called La Société de Notre-Dame de Montréal pour la conversion des sauvages de la Nouvelle-France. The society were dévots, or the devout, sort of the Catholic equivalent of Puritans. The dévots were tired of all this post-Reformation nonsense that was going on in France, where the king was doing skeevy stuff, like tolerating the existence of Protestants and annoying the Pope. They wanted to get back to that there old-time medieval religion, caring for the sick and the poor, but also visions and martyrs and self-flagellation and torturing and murdering heretics and sodomites, and bringing the light of God to the savage heathens of the New World, whether they liked it or not. And it turns out some of the local native population, specifically the members of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy, did not like it. And not only did they not like it, but they had guns, which they had bought from the Dutch and English over in what would become New York State, and they knew how to use them. The Ville-Marie missionaries, and all their good intentions, had plopped themselves down right in the middle of a very dangerous fur trading war between the Iroquois, the English, the Algonquin, the Wendat, the French, the Dutch, and several other tribes. In order to survive, Ville-Marie had to be built as a fortress, with thick, pointy, wooden palisade walls, and soldiers to guard those walls. Enter the subject of this video. In 1648, a mere 6 years after the founding of Ville-Marie, one of those soldiers, a military drummer, was arrested by the Jesuits for what they described as the worst of crimes. Now, we don't know who the other man involved in this worst of crimes was. It's possible that he was Wendat or possibly Algonquin due to the fact that he was never arrested along with his lover. Now, I should mention that New France was pretty open about sexuality, at least compared to the stuffy, straight-laced folks back in the old world. All that fresh air, open space, and exposure to the local cultures had an effect. But Ville-Marie was not having any of that nonsense. They promptly arrested and imprisoned the drummer and sent him down the river, literally, to Quebec City to await punishment. Now, the punishment for homosexuality in France at that time, for both men and women, was burning at the stake. And it seemed as though our friend the drummer was doomed to death by fire. But at the last minute, the Jesuit priests of Quebec City intervened on his behalf and generously offered to send him to the galleys instead. Now, while this was technically better than being flame-broiled to death, it was still not ideal. The galleys were a fleet of French ships which rowed around the Mediterranean, much like the Roman and Greek galleys of 1,000+ years earlier. But instead of slaves, the French galleys were rowed by convicted criminals. Rowers were kept in the bowels of the ship, shackled to their benches, and most of them were forced to row until they died. This meant that the drummer's sentence had effectively been commuted from execution to death by hard labor. But then the Jesuits changed their minds again, and the drummer was offered yet another chance. Instead of joining the world's most horrible rowing team, he could become an executioner. Nobody knows exactly why the Jesuits intervened on this particular man's behalf. Back home, France was in the middle of a vicious counter-reformation, and the Catholic Church was busy showing off how strong and important they were by murdering as many gay men and lesbians as they could get their hands on. And the Jesuits were a big part of that. Maybe the Jesuits, as men of God, recognized that on balance, the drummer's crime wasn't so terrible after all, and perhaps they wanted to show mercy in the manner of that carpenter they liked so very, very much. Or maybe they just needed an executioner really, really badly. We'll probably never know, but either way, the drummer wisely took the deal and became one of Canada's first executioners. Now, it may sound a little weird giving someone convicted of a crime paid government employment, but actually this was a common practice. Being an executioner was a miserable, menial, traumatic job, especially in the era of ropes and axes and hot irons. Not only that, but murdering people, even if it was for the government, was an undeniable 10 Commandments level sin, and it put your soul in real danger of damnation after you died. Which makes it easier to understand why condemned criminals were usually the only people who would willingly do it. So while our friend the drummer managed to escape execution, he was still sentenced to a pretty miserable future. Side note, I should mention that at the very moment that Ville-Marie was being founded in the wilderness of Canada, 1642, back in France, somebody else was gay, or possibly bisexual. And that somebody was Louis XIII, the King of France. Now, the sexual habits of kings and queens tend to be a little murky and are often complicated by things like propaganda or hearsay, and of course, the bizarre and traumatic childhoods and marriage patterns of the nobility. Game of Thrones has nothing on the Habsburgs. However, Louis XIII was known from quite an early age to have almost no interest in girls. In later life, he was actually called Louis the Chaste because of his notable lack of mistresses. He also had several male courtiers who he treated in a suspiciously intimate manner. Louis's grandfather, Henri III, had a reputation for keeping male favorites and was also known to have dressed in women's clothing, including makeup and pearls. And Louis's son, Philippe, was well known to have had a series of male lovers. The aristocracy had dozens of generals and noblemen and noblewomen who were widely known to have lovers of the same sex, not one of whom, I may add, ended up burned to death on a stake or chained to a bench in a galley. So this celebrated weekend, let's remember the drummer of Ville-Marie, whatever his name may have been. And let's also remember the soldiers and midwives and tailors and nurses and farmers and poets and bus drivers and all the ordinary people who suffered and sometimes died for no other crime than loving another adult human being and not being rich or important enough to get away with it. By the way, for a bit more contemporary history on this subject, and maybe a little bit of that inspirational stuff which I completely abandoned at the beginning of this video, please check out Kevin Allen's Queer History Walk. It's sure to be dazzlingly informative, and it is going to be occurring on September the 26th. That's this Saturday at 1:30. Thanks for watching.